Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Food Miles, What Do We Know About Local and Seasonal Food Sourcing? Thank you for joining us today. 2 Degrees is delighted to have with us Peter Lafort and Mark Holmes to speak with us. Now, before we actually begin, here are a few technical instructions for this webinar. If you have problems with the technology or audio, please use the chat box on the right-hand side to send a message. Select Host from the drop-down menu, send a message, and then I'll get back to you. We'll have questions throughout the presentation, and we're going to hold a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, type into the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and then press send. Now, if you'd like to connect through your phone, please use the chat box to contact me for details. All of that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and hand it to our first presenter, Mark Holmes. Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. I'll start. So, hello, my name is Mark Holmes. I'm a Sustainable Food and Farming Consultant for ADAS. I'm going to talk about a recent research project that I managed titled Understanding the Environmental Impacts of Consuming Foods that are Produced Locally in Season. Before we start, I thought we'd have a little bit of a warm-up and I would test your knowledge of what's in season in my garden. You can see I'm assisted by my dog Pepper, who should have stood next to the crop rather than on top of the raised beds. But I'll provide the answer at the end of the session. So to get into the project itself, they're funded by Defra. The research team was led by ADAS, but also included collaborators Mel Brooks from CO Plymouth University and Chris Foster from UJOS. The main aim of the study was to clarify the extent to which encouraging the consumption of locally in season food might reduce the negative impacts of food consumption and be a criteria for sustainable food purchasing. So, for example, if I base my shopping on purchasing food that is in season, will that food have a lower impact than if I purchased out of season? I'm going to skim the surface of the study because it's quite a large study report, and I'll fit what I can in within the 15 minutes. But please do download the full report and bear with me as I will go through it quite quickly to cover some ground. So the project was split into 2 interrelated parts. The life cycle assessment compared different production and UK consumption scenarios. These assessments included carbon and water footprints, as well as other LCA environmental impact categories. Consumer research to explore current awareness, levels of understanding and attitude towards seasonal food. The approach involved consumer groups across the UK were choosing different segments of the population for each focus group, and an online consumer survey as well. Talk a bit about definitions. Even though I started with a photo of my own garden, this project was focused on mainstream food production, so it does not include grow your own. The seasonal food is very well utilised in everyday life, really, but there's not one agreed clear definition of what constitutes food. So if I go to the supermarket and buy in-season food, what is the definition that is guiding my purchasing choice? To conduct the research, we needed to define in-season food production. This raised a number of issues, so I'll just give you some examples to illustrate. So, for example, what about crops grown in tunnels in season? This is a photo taken from my next door neighbour's farm last week, and he's actually harvesting potatoes. He's had a pretty tough time because it's very wet. but you can see he started to store some of his potatoes. Now those potatoes will be sold straight off the field, effectively, but some will be stored up until March. So if those potatoes are stored and then consumed in March, are they in season? And does it make a difference if they're stored using effectively low energy ambient storage or high energy intensive cold storage? You know, these are the types of issues that we had to address within the definitions. So on to the definitions we actually used within the study. After consideration, we decided to use two definitions. The first definition was a global definition. So this is food that's not necessarily consumed locally to where it is grown. So, for example, let's say strawberries grown in the natural growing season within North Africa, but exported to the UK and consumed within the UK. So that was our global definition. We also used a more consumer-focused definition, which does require a local link between production and consumption. The consumer research actually highlighted that consumers only have a vague definition of seasonal food, which the majority define seasonal food as UK produced and consumed, although a significant proportion thought it could be grown anywhere in the world. Just to pick a few points from the consumer research as a starting point. Amazingly, most consumers that took part in the focus groups and the online panel are shopping in supermarkets. We tested within the focus groups. We tested their knowledge of different products in different growing seasons, and most have a better knowledge of certain products. So, for example, strawberries compared to cauliflowers. They've got a better knowledge of when the natural growing season is for strawberries as compared to cauliflowers. Consumers are predominantly using seasonality as a quality measure rather than a pro-environmental purchasing criteria. And also, taste and freshness are the main drivers. Again, these are not surprising results. Some shoppers saw seasonality as one of the characteristics of local food and a reason to shop locally. They closely coupled seasonality with local food. From the focus groups and the online panel, the main barriers that came across as to consuming seasonal foods were cost and knowledge. And again, back onto the food miles issue. Consumers tended to focus on aspects of energy input during delivery, so using the food miles concept rather than energy inputs during production on the farm. And I'll talk about this in some later slides, but we know that the food miles is a nice, simple message that has been well embedded into the minds of consumers. Now, talk a little bit about the life cycle assessment case studies that we conducted. Cycle assessments conducted a number of different food items highlighted on the slide. Again, the aim being to understand the environmental impact of consuming the same food in the UK at different times of year, or the same type of food, type of food products. So, for example, we looked at 3 strawberry production and consumption scenarios, which were Spanish strawberries consumed in the UK in May, UK outdoor produce strawberries consumed in July, so sort of a Wimbledon type of time, and UK glasshouse strawberries consumed in October. hopefully you're getting a feel for the the type of scenarios that we looked at. The next slide is just highlighting really how we came about choosing these scenarios. The scenarios were based on a number of different factors. Trade data, so what are we importing? Production data, what are we producing? And consultation with the industry to identify realistic options. To illustrate, for example, this chart shows imports of Spanish strawberries into the UK, and hence choosing a scenario of Spanish strawberries consumed in May is a realistic option, because that's really we're coming to the peak of those imports. The slide is type of outputs for life cycle assessments, and really, you should look at the full report to get a better feel for what's included and some analysis and interpretation of the results. But just to illustrate the type of output, in this case we're comparing 3 different Raspberry scenarios. So UK and Spanish fresh, but also we've included a frozen one as well, just to look at the impacts of frozen as opposed to fresh. This particular example highlighted the issue of local water availability and stress within local regions where some of these products are produced. So using the weighted water footprint indicator to assess these impacts. As you can see, there's a major difference between the 2 UK and Spanish examples. So picking the conclusions from the life cycle assessments. On the case studies within the study, no single in-season definition consistently delivered lower environmental impacts. So neither the global nor the local definition consistently delivered a lower environmental impact. Locality is fundamental within seasonal food sourcing strategies. So in particular, local resource availability. So, for example, water is very important to the overall impact, and I think you probably saw that in the raspberry example on the previous slide. Yield of the crop or product is very important, and variations in yield can make major change to the overall impact. We could have a situation whereby a product is produced out of season very efficiently, maybe in a state-of-the-art glass house, and that product would have a lower environmental footprint than those grown in season outdoors, but maybe not grown so efficiently with as good management practices. Raises the question: is improvement more useful than selection? So, generally improving production systems, but both in season and out of season, are important than actually selecting whether something is in season or out of season. So, effectively maximising efficient, sustainable production. And we've got case studies again is going back to the raspberry or Spanish strawberry example. We've got trade-offs between sunshine and water. So in some regions, in often regions where we have lots of sunshine and possibly a lower carbon footprint, we have issues with available water resources. So there's the trade-off throughout within all the case studies across the different environmental impact categories. Finally, on this slide, if based solely upon the case studies we looked at, addition of seasonal food incorporating a local link between production and consumption is a better indicator than the global definition in terms of lowering environmental impact. Just to cover the picture around food miles. Obviously, reducing transport distances makes a lot of sense in terms of reducing costs, but also reducing the environmental impact of the transport phase within the whole life cycle of the product. However, a mismatch between the consumer understanding of environmental costs and the real picture. Research showed that consumers tend to focus on the food miles concept rather than energy inputs during production. So, fertilizer used in production, that type of input. So to illustrate the point, I've just used a graphic that I had from a previous project, which is the breakdown of the carbon footprint for a potato produced and delivered to an end customer with 500 kilometres of accumulated transport. So this is UK produced and UK consumed. So even for a very bulky item like potatoes, the major hotspot is still pre-farm gate. So I'm presenting an answer here to how do we communicate this issue to this very complex issue to consumers, but it is a challenge going forward in terms of any communication campaigns about the true cost, the true environmental cost of food production and supply. So again, really just finishing off on some final slides around conclusions. With two definitions, but realistically, for an in-season definition to be meaningful to consumers, there has to be this local link between production and consumption. Again, to reiterate the point, the consumer interest in seasonal food is predominantly based around taste and freshness, and the environmental impact is secondary. A point again, consumers focus on food miles when the lion's share of impact comes from the production phase of the life cycle. Used in isolation, the food as in season is not a good blanket criterion for environmental sustainable food purchasing. When we use it for environmental food purchasing, it needs to be used in conjunction with other areas that encourage efficient production. So, following good agricultural practices, mechanism for achieving this might be through farm assurance. Farm assurance is a way of making sure that food is produced using certain practices. So again, that might be the type of the type of additional criteria that can be used. Again, importantly, resource availability, specifically water resources at the point of production, have to be considered within seasonal food sourcing strategies. That's very important. But it's not realistic for consumers to take these quite complex assessments at the point of sale. These really have to be done by supermarkets and other food procurers within their sourcing strategies. They have to make these risk assessments, before they effectively on the shelf. So I think I'm just about coming up to the 15 minutes, I think. Just to some final thoughts on seasonal food and seasonality. Just now, and I'm sure you've grasped this, but the project I've just described only focused upon the environmental impacts of consuming foods locally in season. We didn't touch on any other benefits or any other areas. So let's not forget the broader perspective that seasonal food itself is a very useful tool to communicating issues around the natural environment and farming, but also healthy eating and encouraging the consumption of whole non-processed foods. So just to make that point, that the project solely looked at environmental impact. And just the answer to the question, I don't know how many of you got it, but it's the COP My Garden Next to the dog is Jerusalem artichoke. And I will be harvesting that very soon. And so that's the end of my presentation. So look forward to questions.
All right, thanks very much, Mark, for the presentation. Great picture as well. So I'm now going to go ahead and hand it over to our second speaker of the day, Peter. Peter?
Thanks, Vanessa.
Great. Go ahead.
Well, yes, thank you. So let me thank Mark for a very interesting presentation, and your Jerusalem architects do look lovely. My name's Peter, and I'm from an organisation called Community Action Groups, which operates in the UK in Oxfordshire, and I support community groups that run grassroots environmental actions and projects from energy to waste and transport, and for the focus of this presentation on food. And I looking at this idea of defining local food. So the two aspects I want to look at. Firstly, I'm going to look at a food printing report that's going to be published soon. Looks at local food within the city of Oxford itself. Looks at the impact of that on Oxford's environment. And secondly, I'm going to look at a different type of local food, the idea of food banks, using the case study of the Oxford Food Bank. So an in-depth look into Oxford specifically, but I do hope you'll find it useful both as quite an innovative case study, but also as a more for looking at local food as a whole. These are the questions I want to frame it around. This idea of where does local food begin and end? How do we define it? And this idea of what do we mean by local food? And generally, I think it's something that Mark touched on as well, local food is defined all the time through the marketing arrangements around it. So it doesn't come straight from the producer to, say, a market or a school, something like that. Sometimes it's defined by distance, but how far away can it be before it's not local? It's a rather subjective issue, sometimes by environmental or ethical terms. But the idea of distance being quite a concrete one is quite difficult, and certainly a survey last year by the local government regulation said that with England and Wales, almost 20% of restaurants were falsely describing food as local. In fact, they were coming as far away as New Zealand, which for England is pretty much as local as you can get. But this definition, it is a marketing one, but I think it's one that affects all of us when we think about the local food. Engage with what you think it means. And second question, why do we need local food? Which I imagine everyone's going to have an answer to, but I'll come back to that towards the end. So the report I want to look at, called Food Printing Oxford, it's to be published later this year. I'm referring to a late draft by Tom Curtis of Landshare. Landshare is a social enterprise which aims to change the way we manage land and its resources. It was commissioned by Oxford City Council on behalf of Low Carbon Oxford, which is an Oxford-wide programme of collaboration between private, public and non-profit organisations. Its aim is to ensure Oxford's future is a sustainable and low-carbon city. And it's based on research carried out, as I say, by Landshare and Best Foot Forward, which is a sustainable footprinting company based in Oxford. The background to the model, to the report itself, and I want to start off by looking at how it places the food system of Oxford within the sustainability as a whole. So as you can see there, the food system accounts for a fifth of the greenhouse gas emissions of the city, the equivalent of 380,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. And this takes into account the process of growing, processing, delivering, and preparing Oxford's food, looking into the huge scale of natural resources which are required to get to this stage. But it looks at what happens after the food has been grown, processed, delivered, and prepared in terms of how much is eaten and how much is wasted. gas emissions, the 20%, that's, to put it in context, that's equivalent to twice the annual emissions from all of Oxford's cars put together. So it's a very substantial amount. According to the report, there is the potential to reduce this footprint and saving the equivalent of 105,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide per year, which in the city whole is 7% of its greenhouse gas emissions. So 7% can be saved through the food system alone, which for a city like Oxford is a fairly significant proportion of its emissions. Factors within this potential improvement, as I put there, change in diet, so reduced meat consumption, reduce food waste, and looking at how the energy itself is created in the first place. So renewable energy used within the production, the less emissions are going to be created. So a bit of perspective on how the food system fits into Oxford's sustainability as a now what it takes to feed a city such as Oxford. So 150,000 people buying a total of 53,000 hectares of agricultural land. So that is equivalent to all of the land contained within a circle extending 13 kilometres outwards from the centre of the city, which is represented on this map here. So the light green in the very centre is the borders of the city itself, and the darker green contained within the red circle is at 53,000 hectares. So you can really the sense of the scale of what would be required. That land would be required to feed the city. So obviously it's not a practical solution because you'd have to get rid of the villagers and the people as well, but just to give a sense of scale. Because the consumption within Oxford's population is almost 130,000 tonnes of food per year, and it equates to around £450 million. So we're talking quite huge numbers. I think it's good to have a visual representation of that. On water, as you got there, you got 398 million tonnes of water per year is used in the food system. So that's the same volume of water that flows down the Thames through Oxford in 8.5 months. So quite a staggering amount of water. And then with energy, 6.6 gigajoules of fossil energy per year, which are required for the city's food system, would cost in barrels of oil, would cost around £70 million, which represents just over 1/6 of Oxford's total annual spend on food. Statistics are assumed to be fairly standard for a city of Oxford's size. So just to give you an idea there. And the food itself, Oxford is widely considered to be a fairly environmentally friendly city, and there's a lot going on in terms of local food, but still within that, only less than 1% of the is direct from local sources. And that 1%, over half of that comes from homegrown produce, so food that's grown in your back garden or on your allotment. So in terms of actual commercial production, it's a very, very small percentage. The food coming to Oxford is from the UK, which is just over 50%, the EU 33%, and then the last 15% comes from elsewhere in the world. And as you can see here, the main deficits across Oxfordshire in terms of what's produced and what's consumed within Oxford are the dairy and the fruit and vegetables. But just look at that last group, for instance, the fruit and vegetables. If you took all of Oxford's current allotments and domestic gardens and any space that was able to grow and vegetables and put it to that purpose, that could produce half of the city's consumption, which would go some way to reducing the impact of farming in, but still only represent 2% of the city's overall requirement for land, eating into that huge map we saw earlier. So obviously that's part of the fact that fruit and vegetables don't require so much space to grow, and just gives you an idea of what's feasible now, changes that we'd have to make in order to make Oxfordshire and Oxford sustainable. Looking at how can the city better, so looking at Oxford, but also using that as a model for other cities. According to the report, its reduction in food waste is the most effective way of reducing that footprint. So with the energy, the water, land that's required to create the food that comes into Oxford, the amount that is wasted, if we can reduce that amount, then that have the biggest impact on the resources that we're using, which definitely makes a lot of sense, but it's sometimes not obvious leap to make. Look, within the UK, we produce over 12.5 million tonnes of food waste a year, and 65% of that is from households, which represents around 15% of the household spending on food. So 50% of the money that is spent on food coming to a domestic setting is wasted. So obviously if we lose that amount, then that's going to have a significant impact. And as it says here, the report discusses how action can be taken on this by 4 of the 5 members of the supply chain. So consumers can buy more wisely, they can cook appropriate amounts, they can store food better, caterers can do the same, retailers can bring in a more big amount of food, bear in mind how much they're going to then sell and processes. So the one member of the supply chain that's not included here is farmers. Farmers, obviously, there's not a lot to do to improve the amount of food they produce and send on, improve the percentage of that is not wasted. And just look at a graph here, which is from the report itself, looking at the UK baseline of resources used in food production, looking at the Oxfordshire or the Oxford usage as well, and that smaller bar on each one, which is the alternative, that's what could be achieved. So I can see in land, water, energy and greenhouse gases, Oxford's food footprints are marginally better than the average. And this is largely accounted for by diet and a better than average performance in waste management. Oxfordshire's one of the leading counties within the UK on its waste management systems. And 1 to 2% difference is small, but it has a significant impact in terms of the savings of the resources. So it means the need for 1,000 fewer hectares of land per year, 10 million tonnes of water per year, fewer are needed. It's the equivalent of 10,000 barrels of oil and the equivalent of 3,500 tonnes of carbon dioxide in greenhouse gas emissions. So quite significant savings, and then there's 1 to 2%. So it gives you an idea of what could be achieved if we went down to what the report suggests as an alternative, what can be achieved reasonably realistically. So against the UK baseline of 100%, we could be using only 59% of the land, 73% of the water, 69% of the energy, and 64% of the greenhouse gases. And I would suggest looking into the report when it comes out at the end of this year on the Landshare website for a further breakdown of those statistics and what they mean. I can't go into too much depth now. That's the food printing report. Next, I want to look at the Oxford Food Bank as a study of an alternative type of food, following on from this idea of food waste being the biggest area in which we can improve the food print of Oxford, our model city here. So the food bank, launched in October 2009. It's run entirely by volunteers. And what it does is it gets food from retailers and wholesalers and then redistributes it to the community. So there's no money involved. It takes in this food that would otherwise be thrown away and it gives it to people who need the food. It provides up to 5,000 meals a week to people living in food poverty. It delivers to 17 charities within the city itself, and many of those on a daily basis. And as you can see there, 1.5 tonnes of food a week are distributed by the food bank, growing as it gets bigger and bigger with more volunteers and a larger network. Here we're kind of looking into food in a slightly different way and engaging with the fact that the right to food as part of the UN's Universal Human Rights Framework. So this idea of food a necessity, which is something that I think often gets left out. So the Oxford Food Bank, this creates the question of when does food become local, which we think about in terms of how we're defining it. So as I said on the last slide, the bank will take food that would otherwise end up on landfill, shown by the image on the left, and gives it to people to be turned into edible food, shown on the right. Obviously, there are issues there of these, why are the wholesalers and retailers having to get rid of their food because it's beyond sell-by dates and these kind of restrictions, but it's still safe enough to eat. There's also, so the food has been brought into Oxfordshire, wasted, it will be wasted within Oxfordshire. The food waste costs the local authority money to dispose of, and then by extension through taxes, the residents who have already, in many cases, paid for it once already. So really looking at food in a different way, does this count as local food? I don't think there's the answer, but it's certainly something I'd like to engage with, and I'd be interested to know what your thoughts were on that. If the food has come in to Oxfordshire, and that's where it is, that's where it's either going to be eaten or wasted, is it then local? Can we then term that to be local food? And I certainly think that this idea represented by the food bank is not a long-term solution. It's a plaster over the problems inherent in the current system, but it's an example of an aspect of local food which is often missed out, and of the disconnect between our view of the importance of local food and the importance of food itself. So the idea is distribution, on which also Oxford's specific example is one which echoes statistics which show that a third of all food produced for human consumption globally is wasted, ends up on landfill, when near a billion people are in food poverty worldwide, according to the UN. And to finish up, I'd like to come back to my initial question, this idea of defining local food. So what do we mean by local food? Do we need local food? And do these questions match up? Are what we want to see from local food, are things meeting what we need for local food? I always think about local food. I've got the image there, which is from Cultivate, which is a group within Oxford that grows and sells local food. It gives up these images of food on your doorstep, sort of the ripe, seasonal, healthy food. It's great, but it's very much a fetishized image, which certainly ignores the vast majority of factors which make food such a crucial issue worldwide. Issues like income, time, and education. As the food bank demonstrates, food is a means to an end rather than an end in and of itself. I think we talk about local food, it's the word local, which is the key one, the one we get caught up on and struggle to define. But then the debates continue. I think it's always important to remember that we need food as well, and not to leave that out of the equation. I think it's not to separate the idea of local food from the idea of food, and what our motivations are around local food, and I imagine are varied. The solutions beyond the obvious image of homegrown vegetables. The solution is not always grow more local food. What the food printing report suggests is that use locally grown food of diversifying the supply chain, not replacing it. So it's part of the solution. It itself is not the natural problem. It's a threat to the environment in the ways that we covered before, because we demand so much of it. But the system is significantly inefficient in both production and distribution. So, lastly, on the final question, why do we need local food? I think if we can better define what we mean by local food and we need from local food, then only then will we be able to start to identify solutions which address address the obvious factors such as diminishing natural resources and public health and issues on those lines, as well as the bigger picture and poverty, and just getting to what food represents in and of itself. They're the questions I'd like to leave you with. I mean, what do we mean by local food, and what do we need? Why need local food? And I certainly urge you to read the food printing report when it comes out later this year. So check out the landshare.org website for that. And I think I've reached the end of my time, so I'll finish up there. And thank you for listening, and look forward to your questions.
All right, thanks very much, Peter, and thanks very much, Mark, as well. So now we're going to go ahead and jump into our Q&A session. Remember to all the attendees, post your questions in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and start here. This question is from Mark. Why did ADAS choose to research into food miles? Why did you decide to do such a project on that specific topic?
It was actually commissioned by Defra, so that's the reason we decided to do the project, and it was to run that topic area really, because it's to see whether seasonal food or in season could be used as a criteria for purchasing, to lower environmental impact through purchasing. And that's basically, that's the reason we did the work, that it was commissioned by Defra. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think it was a very, I think it is an incredibly interesting area, but it was, it's developed by, commissioned by Defra to inform their policy making.
Okay, pretty straightforward for that one.
Yeah.
So our question can be to either panelist. More opinion here. What can be done to educate the consumer about the food mile misunderstanding? Seems a lot of misunderstanding. Are major supermarkets taking this on their comms campaigns? Either one, free to answer if you like.
I think if I just chip in first, and then Peter can add his view. I mean, I think the we've got is that the food miles as a concept is very simple, very easy to understand, and it's easily embedded within the minds of consumers. Whereas this issue of the environmental burden being, on the production phase, it's very, very complicated when we start talking about fertilizer use and that type of thing. So local resource availability in terms of water stress within local regions and that type of thing. So I'll be honest, I haven't really got an answer, but apart from the answer is that these risk assessments need to be conducted by the market as part of the sourcing strategy, because I think it's unrealistic to label on a product with these different environmental impacts and expect the consumer to make that choice. I think it has to be done. These risk assessments have to be done by the supermarket and other food procurers. So that's my view, and I don't know, Peter, have you got anything?
I think, I mean, I'd echo what you say, and also I think what you about there's a difference between a supermarket acknowledgement of food miles in its own procurement, but also in its communications, and just put on a product the miles that wouldn't help anyone make any real decisions about what it meant, and it wouldn't engage with where that type of food be grown, was it naturally grown, how intensive is it to be grown close to where it's being sold. So I think definitely there's a disparity between actually finding out information and then communicating it. I don't think supermarkets should be at the forefront of this, how that's done.
Okay, thanks for your responses. On to the next question. Is the demand for local food driven by consumers, businesses, or academics? What are your opinions on that? Mark, Peter, same to either one of you.
I'll just jump in there first. I think in the same with, most consumption businesses certainly will create a demand for local food because of the ideas of quality that go with it, and also consumers recognise, and as Mark was talking about, there's quality associated with seasonal food. So I think it's a demand for both, but people, each group, in terms of consumers and businesses, I'm less sure about academics, but with consumers and businesses, there's definitely the demand for local food, but the meaning behind it, I think, is often different between what they're looking for, which again, so it's not any answer to the question, but I think for me, that's what the question brings up.
Yeah, I agree. I think I think consumers are, pulling supply chains in that respect in terms of, they're creating demand. But I think obviously in the past 10 years, probably the whole, phenomenon around sort of celebrity chefs, and obviously it's become a lot more popular in terms of local food on television and all the different programs. I think to a certain extent they're encouraging encouraging demand for local food as well, but that tends to be focusing more on a sort of a quality, but also a community type of benefit as opposed to environmental impact. So yeah, I think ultimately consumers buy the food, so they will drive demand.
Very much for that. We have quite a few questions rolling in, so I'm going to go ahead and plow through. Instead of focusing on individually sourcing local food, should we move towards a focus on collaboration and how we can help each other? I think the food bank kind of fits into this. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that's a fantastic question. We should be always moving towards focus on collaboration. I think in all areas, not just the food. And I think for me, this question touches on when we're sourcing local food individually, it's getting towards talking about the kind of the fetishization of local food, and thinking of one individually grown carrot that looks I don't know, quite nobbly and nice. But when we're looking at collaboration and people working together, and it's about food, it's about the redistribution of it. And once we've grown it, what do we do with it then? We don't want to waste it. We want to make sure everybody gets it. And realistically, not everybody can be growing local food, and not everybody should be growing food. It's not something that everybody needs to be doing. And if people are growing it, and enough people are distributing it, and enough people are preparing it, then everybody gets to eat it.
Okay, great. And on to our next question. I think this will be directed towards Mark. Will the Defra project be followed up by examining the social impacts of local versus global food? Do you know anything about that?
There's no plans, but obviously that's something that we'd like to do, because I highlighted on the last slide that that's to some extent that's a weakness within the study, that we only looked at the environmental impact when all these issues around local economic benefit and supporting communities are important. But to answer the question, there's no plans. There's no plans at the moment to look at, but we'd like to.
Thank you for your response, Mark. I'm going to go ahead and go through 4 more questions, and I think we're going to close up for the day. So next question, what can be done by local authorities to try and encourage local food supply by suppliers when procurement laws say you cannot state local in a tender document? It's either panelists, so I'll just let you guys go ahead and take it through.
Yeah, sorry, you go ahead, Peter.
Thanks. My approach to that, I think, is that it's a very tricky situation, but I think local authorities support food. They should support communities to grow and develop local and make it better than the alternative. And if it's not better than the alternative, then the fact that the laws mean they can't pick when something else is better. I mean, there's an element of common sense in that. But if they support people, their local communities, to grow food, and through that grow resilience, improve education and skill sharing, then they won't to show a preference to local food. It will be the better option. Sorry, Mark.
I mean, this is actually an area of interest for me, because I've done a lot of work over the past probably 6 or 7 years in this area, and I think the fundamental issue is that if local authorities and other public sector food procurers are assessing tenders purely on quality, quality and price, and it's very difficult for local suppliers to compete. But when we know that it's a much wider in terms of local economic benefit, community engagement, sort of healthy eating campaigns. So I think the biggest challenge is actually how we're measuring the benefit, as opposed to just measuring it on the price of the product. Effectively, procure the lowest priced product. So I think that's the biggest issue, is how local authorities and the NHS and others actually evaluate options for procuring food. And obviously, in the current economic climate, major challenge. So, but fundamentally, I think that's the issue, is how you actually evaluate the benefits of local food, or the benefits of in comparison to other sources. And obviously, people have tried to get around the fact that you can't. Just to answer the question about you can't specify local. People have tried to get around it by saying, specifying seasonal, specifying organic. But the fundamental issue is that you've got to demonstrate that added value of local food in comparison to other foods. And I don't think that the options are there at the moment, or the way of evaluating these tenders. So.
Thanks very much for the responses. So the next question has a little bit of a personal view here. I try to support local food when I can, but when confronted with prices, I buy what's cheaper. How do we make the argument for local food for those who can't always afford the local price?
Well, I'll jump into that first, and then Mark can give his answer. I think that's a really important question. It's one that isn't an easy answer to. I think there are some things, though, that can help, certainly. And this ties back into what I was saying about food waste. If we acknowledge that, on average, within the UK, 15% of food that's bought in households is then wasted, we're all spending more than we need to food that we use. And if we buy food more appropriately, if we buy the right amount and store food properly, then we'll automatically be spending. Actually, then if you do that, you can afford to buy the food that is more expensive, the local food. And while they are kind of disparate points, it's all about sort of education and understanding food, and understanding where it comes from, and getting out of this idea of just buying what supermarkets are dictating to you that you buy. So I'm sorry, it's not a complete answer to the question, but I myself would love to hear as well. Mark?
Yeah, and I completely agree with what Peter's just said about waste. Consumer food waste is a huge issue, and actually understanding how to correctly store food. Places like WRAP have gone on the WRAP website, and there's different guides in terms of how to correctly store different food types. But I think I've really got an answer to the upon maybe if you've got go and find out a local farmer or a local and get see if you can buy often farmers will sell produce direct, whether it's a 25 kilogram bag of potatoes that's good value, or whether it's carrots or whatever. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, and sort of finding local farmers. But it's good for, it's enjoyable doing it. There's more benefits from there's not just the benefits of buying quality food at a better price. There's the benefits of getting out into the countryside and sort of and talking to farmers. But that's probably my only idea, unfortunately. So
our next question, as mentioned by Peter, reducing food waste is the most effective way of reducing footprints. Is there a legal framework that supports projects like the Oxford Food Bank that you know of? Peter?
There aren't, I know of. There may well be, and certainly I only know about within Oxfordshire, so I wouldn't know about the UK or globally. There are ways that it can be supported by local authorities. I mean, certainly within Oxford, the food bank is reducing the amount of waste that then goes to landfill or to get treated and through anaerobic digestion, and all of that has a cost saving attached to it. So you could look at the food bank and say you calculate exactly how much it's saving the local authority. So then, in theory, is then funding available to products such as the food bank. Obviously, it's not quite as simple, and those links aren't made immediately. But I think local authorities certainly are becoming more and more aware. So where aren't specific legal frameworks, I think there's more of a willing for local authorities to work with other groups that are provide services to the communities that are of real benefit, like the food bank. It's certainly something I'd love to see a lot more of.
Okay, I have a comment here in relation to that. Fair Share and Food Cycle are other food waste organizations working in similar ways to the Oxford Food Bank on a national level. So thanks for that insight, Helen. So we're on to our final question for the day. I appreciate Peter and Mark for holding on strong with these. What are some strategies for food retailers who want to better incorporate seasonal local food into their supply chain? If you have any insights on that. Mark?
Again, it really comes back down to this, the assessments, in isolation, seasonal food or in-season food is not a good criteria in terms of environmental impact, that is. So they really need to look at their supply chains, look where the food's coming from, and ensure that those farmers and those distributors are using best practice. So, for instance, in terms of farm production, there's farm assurance standards, so whether that's red tractor, whether that's leaf, it's just making sure that those farmers are using resources as efficiently as possible. But also look at the regions of the UK, but also around the world in terms of where those products are being produced. Are they damaging the local environment? Are there practices that they could be using that improve in their environmental footprint? So it's taking a good look at their seasonal food supply chains and ensuring that they can mitigate any risks as much as possible in them. So it's the same message that I promoted within the presentation. It's not just about procuring in-season food. It's actually looking at how that food is being produced as well.
Okay, Peter, do you have any remarks on that?
Not really. I think I'd agree with everything Mark said there. The other thing I was that it's not just up to food retailers in that aspect. It's always important, whoever you are and wherever you fit into the supply chain, to always engage people, and it's time to engage retailers with what's going around them locally. Because obviously, if they're selling food, it's very busy, and they might not be aware of what can get. And I think trying to engage people, and I mean, as this is sort of the last question, I think it kind of sums it up in general. It's always trying to engage other people about the options and about what is out there, because nobody's going to have all of the answers.
Okay, thank you, Peter and Mark, for your responses. So wrapping up, it looks like there's a lot of interest in consumer education and retailer strategies on this topic. So hopefully we can continue to work on closing the gap. I think we've reached the end of our session today. I'd like to thank all the attendees for participating, for your questions, comments, and ideas. And a big thanks to both Peter and Mark for the great presentations. Thanks very much, guys, for joining us today. So the recording and relevant info will be posted shortly on the supply chain group on the 2 Degrees site. I'll also be sending a follow-up email to attendees, and you'll be able to reach the links through there as well. So with that, many thanks to everyone, and have a wonderful day.